The German MG-42 was slicing the forest like God's own buzzsaw. Within minutes it had pinned an entire ranger platoon to the mud with smoke and splinters and screams filling the air. Until Sergeant Thomas Hale looked down at his dented canteen and realized he was holding the one thing that might save them all. Though this moment of clarity came in the middle of chaos in the Hurtgen Forest in 1944, one of the darkest and deadliest battlefields in Europe, where pines grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, where mud sucked at boots with every step, where the constant thump of distant artillery mixed with cold rain dripping from branches and the metallic smell of wet earth and old blood, where Germans had fortified every ridge with wire and mines and booby traps that turned the forest into a death trap, where fields of fire remained invisible until bullets started flying, and where American Rangers were forced to fight uphill through freezing fog against an enemy who could see them but couldn't be seen. What happened next? A simple trick involving a Ranger's canteen would turn a pinned platoon into a steamroller and put 27 German soldiers out of the fight in just 40 minutes. Though the story really begins with understanding why the Hurtgen Forest was hell incarnate for American forces, why every yard gained cost blood, why soldiers who survived it would wake up decades later with the sound of MG-42s still echoing in their nightmares. Because this wasn't open-terrain warfare where you could see the enemy and call in airstrikes or artillery. This was close-quarters forest combat where visibility was measured in yards not miles, where the Germans had months to prepare defensive positions that were invisible until you triggered them, where the dense trees absorbed radio signals and made communication nearly impossible, where the cold and wet sapped strength faster than combat, and where every attack became a grinding meat grinder that consumed entire companies and left survivors questioning whether any objective was worth the casualties. Sergeant Thomas Hale was 23 years old, tough and wiry with sharp eyes that missed nothing, a former steel mill worker from Pittsburgh who understood machinery and angles and sound and pressure from years of working around blast furnaces and rolling mills where paying attention to acoustics meant the difference between catching a problem before equipment failed or watching someone get killed by flying metal, who used logic under fire when other men panicked, who had a reputation among the Rangers for keeping calm under chaos that would break lesser soldiers, and who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd worked dangerous jobs and knew that fear was natural but paralysis was death. On this particular November day, his platoon, 38 Rangers who'd already been through Sicily and Normandy, had been tasked with advancing down a narrow forest trail to clear a series of German defensive pockets that were holding up the American advance, to link up with elements of the 4th Infantry Division somewhere ahead in the fog, and to prevent a German counterattack that intelligence suggested was forming in the woods, a straightforward mission that should have been completed by nightfall, except that everything had gone catastrophically wrong within the first 15 minutes when a German MG-42 machine gun opened up from a perfectly concealed position, its distinctive sound, like fabric tearing, like a buzzsaw cutting through steel, like death itself given mechanical form, filling the forest as it fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that you couldn't hear individual shots but only a continuous roar, backed by riflemen positioned in mutually supporting foxholes and a sniper somewhere in the canopy who started dropping Rangers one by one with shots so precise they suggested someone who'd been hunting these woods for months and knew every angle, every sight line, every position where an American soldier might take cover. Trees exploded into storms of splinters as machine gun fire chewed through wood that had stood for decades, bark and sap and chunks of pine flying through the air like shrapnel, and 2 Rangers died in the first assault when they tried to reposition for a flanking attack, their bodies cut down before they'd moved 10 feet, creating a situation where the platoon was frozen under fire with men pressed flat behind whatever cover they could find, fallen logs, shallow depressions in the ground, the trunks of trees that might stop rifle rounds but wouldn't stop sustained machine gun fire, waiting for the MG-42 to systematically work through their positions and finish them off while German mortars began dropping behind them with precisely timed salvos that suggested forward observers were calling in coordinates, cutting off any possibility of retreat and turning the Rangers' position from tactical disadvantage into death trap. Private James Carter, a rifleman from Ohio who survived the battle, would recall decades later in a documentary interview conducted when he was 78 years old. It was like walking into a meat grinder. You couldn't see the Krauts, but they could see every one of us, could see us moving, could hear us breathing, and that MG-42 just kept firing and firing, never seemed to run out of ammunition, and every burst walked closer to where we were hiding, and we all knew that in maybe 5 more minutes everyone in that clearing was going to be dead, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it because moving meant dying and staying meant dying slower. The psychological weight was crushing. The certainty that you were about to die, that all your training and experience and survival instinct didn't matter because you'd walked into a perfectly prepared ambush and the mathematics of the situation allowed for only one outcome. And Hale could see it in the faces of the men around him, could see the resignation starting to set in, the acceptance that this was where their war ended, and he felt rage building inside him, rage at the situation and the Germans and the forest itself, but also rage at the idea of just accepting death without trying something. Anything, even if it was desperate and probably wouldn't work. Hale crawled behind a split pine tree that provided marginal cover. His body pressed so flat against the ground that mud and pine needles were grinding into his uniform, and in that moment of temporary safety he felt the full weight of frustration and fear and desperate need to find a solution. And his hands moved automatically to check his equipment, inventory his resources, see what he had that might be useful. Rifle with maybe 30 rounds left. 2 grenades that wouldn't reach the German. Position from here, a combat knife that was useless at this range. And his canteen which he pulled from its pouch intending to take a drink because his mouth was dry with fear and his throat felt like sandpaper. The canteen was dented. He'd noticed that earlier when a German round had grazed it during the initial ambush, the bullet hitting at an angle that left a significant indentation in the aluminum but hadn't penetrated. And as Hale tilted it to drink he heard something strange, something that made him pause with the canteen halfway to his lips. The dent had changed the acoustics of the container, changed how water sloshed inside, creating a hollow metallic gurgling sound that was distinctly different from a normal canteen, almost musical in its weird resonance. And in that instant, Hale's mind made a connection that would save his entire platoon, made a leap from observation to tactical application that came from his years working in the steel mill where sound told you everything. Told you when machinery was failing, when metal was stressed, when something was about to break, and where understanding acoustics meant survival. The Rangers were pinned because Germans fired immediately at any sound that suggested movement. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the clank of metal against metal, the scrape of a boot on rock. Anything that indicated an American soldier was trying to reposition, and the Germans had set up their defensive position perfectly to exploit this, had created overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach, had positioned themselves so they could hear movement from multiple directions, had probably been in this position for days and knew every sound the forest made naturally versus every sound that meant enemy activity. Hale realized with sudden clarity that he could use this German responsiveness against them, could use sound not as something to avoid but as a weapon, could manipulate where the Germans aimed by manipulating what they heard, and the dented canteen with its strange acoustic properties was the perfect tool for sound manipulation because it didn't sound like a canteen anymore, it sounded like something else, something that might be equipment or movement or a soldier trying to be stealthy, and that sound would draw fire, would make the Germans reveal their positions, would create opportunities for his Rangers to shoot back. He remembered something a foreman at the mill used to say, an old Polish guy named Kowalski who'd worked steel for 40 years and who would test metal by sound, would tap it with a hammer and listen to the ring and know from that sound whether the metal was good or had internal flaws, and Kowalski had once told Hale, "Sound tells you where the hammer's gonna fall before it does. You learn to listen, you learn to survive." Hale tested his theory with a simple experiment that would either confirm his hypothesis or get him killed. He shook the canteen gently, producing that hollow metallic pop, and then tossed it lightly into the brush about 10 feet to his left, away from where any Rangers were positioned, and the response was immediate and dramatic. The German MG-42 swung its barrel and unleashed a burst that tore through the exact spot where the canteen had landed, at least 50 rounds in 3 seconds. The tracers visible in the gloom showing the machine gun's line of fire shifting 2 feet away from where Hale's squad was actually positioned, and when the burst ended there was a moment of silence and then Hale heard German voices, heard someone shouting what sounded like a question, probably asking if they'd hit anyone, and Hale realized he'd just discovered something profound. The Germans couldn't actually see the Rangers clearly through the fog and vegetation. They were firing at sound, at movement indicators, at anything that suggested a target, which meant their superior position wasn't quite as superior as it seemed if the sound could be manipulated. The other Rangers stared at Hale like he was insane, probably thinking he'd cracked under pressure and was now playing with his canteen while they were all about to die. But Hale was seeing the battlefield differently now, was understanding it not as a physical space but as an acoustic environment where sound traveled through trees and bounced off trunks and echoed in ways that could be predicted and exploited, where the Germans' reliance on audio cues to locate targets was both their strength and their vulnerability, and where a dented canteen could become the most important weapon in his arsenal because it could make the Germans think movement was happening where it wasn't, could draw fire away from actual Ranger positions and create windows of opportunity measured in seconds but enough for trained soldiers to exploit. Hale quickly formulated a plan that was part physics, part psychology, and entirely desperate. He would empty the remaining water from his canteen to reduce weight and change the acoustic properties, then fill it approximately halfway. Experimentation would determine the exact amount, to create maximum resonance from the dent, and he would attach it to something that would let him move it at a distance, something like the communications wire that was strung through some of the trees for field telephone lines that had been cut by artillery days ago, wire that he could tie to the canteen and use to drag it across the ground to mimic the sound of someone crawling through brush, creating an audio signature that would sound like a ranger trying to flank the German position. His hands worked quickly, dumping water, refilling from a puddle to the halfway point, shaking the canteen to test the sound. Yes, that weird hollow metallic echo was perfect, was exactly the kind of ambiguous noise that would trigger a response, and then tearing a length of communications wire from a nearby tree trunk, about 15 feet of thin steel cable that he tied through the canteen's clip with knots he'd learned in Boy Scouts a lifetime ago when he was 12 years old and the biggest worry in his life was whether he'd earn his hiking merit badge. The moment of truth came when Hale pulled the wire, dragging the canteen slowly through the leaf litter and mud, creating a rustling, scraping sound punctuated by the hollow clang of the dented metal, and the German reaction was instantaneous and exactly what he'd hoped for. The MG-42 swung toward the sound and unleashed a thunderous burst, tracers arcing through the fog to hit the ground where the canteen was moving, where the Germans believed an American soldier was crawling. And that burst lasted maybe 3 seconds during which the machine gun was focused entirely on the wrong target. 3 seconds during which every German defender was watching that spot instead of watching the actual Ranger positions, and 3 seconds was enough. Hale rose from behind his cover, brought his M1 Garand to his shoulder with the smooth motion of thousands of hours of training, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, the rifle bucking against his shoulder, the spent clips ejecting with that distinctive ping, and through his sights he saw the German loader, the soldier feeding ammunition belts into the MG-42, jerk backward as at least one round hit center mass, saw the man fall away from the weapon, and simultaneously another Ranger, a corporal named Dutch Harrison who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, fired a burst from his Browning automatic rifle that caught the machine gunner in the head and shoulder, the heavy .30-06 rounds at close range doing catastrophic damage, and suddenly the MG-42 went silent. That terrible continuous roar that had dominated the battlefield for the past 10 minutes just stopped, and in the silence that followed Hale could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Rangers breathing, could hear the wind moving through pine branches, and he knew they just achieved something that had seemed impossible 60 seconds earlier. But the battle was far from over. The machine gun was neutralized, but there were still German riflemen in foxholes scattered through the defensive position. There was still a sniper somewhere in the canopy who'd killed 2 Rangers already, and somewhere to the right there was movement suggesting a second MG-42 team was repositioning to engage, trying to restore the defensive line that had just been breached, and Hale realized that his canteen trick had worked once, but now he needed to use it systematically, needed to turn this desperate improvisation into a tactical method that could clear the entire German position. For the next 40 minutes, though afterward nobody could agree on exactly how long the assault lasted, with some saying 30 minutes and others saying almost an hour, time becoming fluid the way it always does in combat. Hale used the canteen trick with increasing sophistication, developing variations and techniques that turned sound manipulation into an art form, and each application of the trick revealed more German positions and created more opportunities for the Rangers to advance. The first variation was simple position revelation. Hale would drag the canteen through brush in different directions, creating rustling sounds that suggested movement and German soldiers. Unable to see clearly through the fog and vegetation, operating on instinct and training that said shoot at anything that moves, would fire at the sound, their muzzle flashes giving away their exact positions, and Rangers who'd been pinned down for the past 15 minutes suddenly had targets they could see, foxholes they could identify, and they began eliminating German defenders one by one with aimed fire, the M1 Garand proving its worth as Rangers fired and reloaded and fired again, 8-round clips being emptied in seconds and replaced with the smooth efficiency of men who'd practiced this action 10,000 times. The second variation was confusion through multiple sound sources. Hale realized he could create the impression of multiple attackers flanking from different directions by tossing the canteen to different locations, rolling it downhill where it would clatter against rocks and roots, bouncing it off tree trunks to create echoes, even at one point swinging it overhead on the wire and releasing it to land in a bush 20 yards away where it created a crash that sounded like someone falling. And the Germans began reacting to these sounds with increasingly panicked fire, began shooting at positions where no Americans actually existed, began wasting ammunition and revealing themselves, and most importantly began losing the psychological advantage that came from being the ambushers, began feeling like they were the ones being ambushed, surrounded, outmaneuvered. The sniper elimination was a masterpiece of patience and psychology. Hale knew there was a German sniper in the canopy somewhere. They'd all seen the muzzle flash once or twice, had a general idea of direction but not precise location. And snipers were notoriously difficult to spot unless they fired, but they would fire at what looked like good targets, at exposed soldiers or command personnel or anyone stupid enough to show themselves. So Hale created a target that wasn't a soldier by tossing the canteen behind a stump that provided cover, letting it land with a distinctive clang, and then waiting, remaining absolutely still for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, and when the sniper shot, probably thinking the sound was someone taking position behind that stump, thinking he could score a kill before his target had settled in, the muzzle flash revealed his position in a pine tree about 40 yards upslope, and 3 Rangers who'd been waiting for exactly this information fired simultaneously at that tree, their rounds chewing through branches and bark, and something fell from the canopy, something that might have been a rifle and might have been a person. And after that there were no more sniper shots, no more Rangers suddenly dropping with precision headshots, and another piece of the German defensive position had been neutralized. The second machine gun position was more challenging because the Germans had learned from watching their first MG-42 get taken out, had realized that something was drawing their fire that wasn't actually American soldiers, had probably figured out they were being deceived, though they might not have understood exactly how. But Hale adapted his tactics, tied the canteen to a long branch and used it to create a swinging pendulum motion that made the canteen click rhythmically against tree bark. Sound that was hypnotic and annoying and impossible for the German gunner to ignore because it suggested someone was behind that tree using it for cover. And when the MG-42 opened fire at the tree, the Rangers flanked from the opposite direction, moved while the Germans were distracted, and killed the machine gun crew with grenades and rifle fire, the explosions echoing through the forest and marking the end of German heavy weapons in this sector. A German squad tried to make a stand in a small ravine. Hale could hear an officer or NCO rallying them, could hear the distinctive sounds of weapons being readied, could sense they were preparing for either a desperate defense or a counterattack. And this is when Hale sent the canteen rolling downhill, just released it at the top of a slope and let gravity do the work, and the canteen tumbled and bounced and created a cacophony of metallic clangs that sounded like multiple soldiers running, sounded like an entire assault force charging their position, and the Germans in that ravine made the fatal mistake of repositioning to meet what they thought was a frontal assault, exposing themselves as they moved, and 3 Rangers who'd been waiting in ambush positions cut them down with overlapping fields of fire, the coordination so perfect it looked choreographed. And by the end of that engagement there were 5 more German casualties and 0 Ranger losses. The final assault came when a German officer, probably realizing his defensive position was collapsing, probably understanding that he needed to either retreat or make a last stand, rallied the remaining defenders into a consolidated position around what looked like a communications trench, and Hale could hear him shouting orders, could hear the distinctive sound of bolt-action rifles being loaded, could sense that this was where the Germans would make their final stand. And for this Hale used the canteen one last time, throwing it high into a bush that overhung the German position, throwing it with enough arc that it landed with a loud metallic crash right in the middle of where the Germans were clustered, and their response was to concentrate all their remaining fire on that sound, to pour everything they had into that bush, dozens of rounds from multiple rifles converging on a single point, and while they were doing that, the Rangers stormed the trench from 3 directions. Simultaneously, caught the Germans in the open with their attention focused on the wrong threat, and the final firefight lasted maybe 20 seconds before the surviving Germans threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. When the shooting finally stopped, when the last echo of gunfire faded into the fog and all that remained was the ringing in everyone's ears and the smell of cordite and blood, the accounting was brutal and definitive. 27 German soldiers dead, their bodies scattered through the defensive position in foxholes and trenches and behind trees where they'd made their stands, 12 more captured with wounds ranging from minor to critical, the entire defensive position that had seemed impregnable 30 minutes earlier now completely destroyed, and remarkably, not a single Ranger had been killed in the final push, though several were wounded and everyone was operating on pure adrenaline, and The shaking relief that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. The forest fell silent except for the drip of water from trees and the distant thump of artillery miles away, and the sound of men breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened, trying to reconcile the fact that they were alive when every instinct had told them they were going to die in this frozen German forest. And Hale collapsed next to the same split pine tree he'd used for cover at the beginning of the engagement. His hands trembling so violently, he couldn't hold his rifle steady. His whole body shaking with adrenaline crash as the survival chemicals drained from his system and left him feeling hollowed out and exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced before. He stared at the canteen. This dented aluminum cylinder that had somehow become the most important piece of equipment in the entire battle. And he couldn't quite process how something so mundane had become so critical, how a random bullet impact that bent metal had created acoustic properties that allowed for sound manipulation that turned a pinned platoon into an attacking force that had just eliminated or captured 39 German soldiers in 40 minutes. And he started laughing, not from joy but from the sheer absurdity of it, from the recognition that war was sometimes won not by superior firepower or numbers but by accidents and improvisation and someone being smart enough to recognize when a mistake had created an opportunity. Rangers walked past, some of them stopping to shake Hale's hand, others just nodding with the kind of respect that combat veterans give to someone who saved their lives. And a Navy corpsman who'd been treating wounded in the middle of the firefight paused to check Hale's arm where a splinter had grazed him. Nothing serious, just bleeding enough to stain his uniform, and wrapped it with a quick bandage while telling Hale, "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen and I've been with Rangers since. Sicily, using a canteen like that, thought you'd lost your mind until it actually worked." The platoon leader, a first lieutenant named Morrison who'd graduated from West Point 3 years earlier and who looked about 40 years old despite being 25, found Hale sitting against his tree and just stared at him for a long moment before saying in a voice that shook slightly, "Tom, you saved all of us, you understand that? We were dead, we were all dead, and you turned it around with a goddamn canteen, and I don't know whether to recommend you for a medal or get you a psychiatric evaluation, but either way I'm buying you so many drinks when we get out of this forest that you won't remember your name." The Rangers secured the ridge, established a defensive perimeter, and sent scouts forward to ensure there were no more German positions waiting to ambush them. And when the company commander arrived an hour later to assess the situation and heard the after-action report, heard about the machine gun nest and the pinned platoon and the canteen trick that had turned the entire engagement around, he laughed, actually laughed out loud with a mixture of disbelief and admiration, and said, "A canteen? You took out 27 Krauts with a canteen?" But then his expression turned serious and he added, "Get this man a new one, because that one just became a piece of military history." The story of Hale's improvisation spread through the Ranger battalions with the speed of wildfire, carried by soldiers who'd been there, embellished slightly with each retelling but never straying too far from the essential truth that one sergeant had figured out how to weaponize sound using a dented canteen, and within weeks new recruits were being taught sound-baiting techniques, NCOs were incorporating acoustic deception into night movement drills, and officers were logging the tactic in after-action reports with recommendations that it be added to infantry training doctrine, though like most battlefield innovations discovered by enlisted men it would take years for it to make its way into official manuals if it ever did at all. Hale kept the dented canteen for the rest of the war, carried it through the remainder of the Hurtgen Forest campaign and later into Germany itself, never used it for water again but kept it as a reminder of the day when an accident had become salvation, when a bullet impact had created a tool that saved 38 lives, and sometimes in quiet moments he would shake it just to hear that hollow metallic sound that had changed everything, would remember the terror and the desperation and the moment of insight that had emerged from that terror, would think about the men who died before he figured it out and the men who lived because he had, and the weight of both those groups would settle on him in ways that medals and commendations could never acknowledge or resolve. After the war Hale returned to Pittsburgh, went back to work in the steel mills, married a woman named Dorothy who worked in a typing pool and who never asked too many questions about what he'd done in Europe, raised 2 sons who knew their father had been a ranger but who got very few details about his service beyond the basic facts, and lived a quiet life that from the outside looked utterly normal, looked like the life of any working-class American who'd done his duty and come home and gotten on with living, but inside Hale carried the forest with him, carried the sounds of the MG-42 and the screams of wounded rangers and the hollow clang of his canteen hitting brush, carried them through decades of shift work and family dinners and little league games and retirement parties, and sometimes he would wake up at 3 a.m. with his heart racing and his hands shaking, would go to the garage where he kept his wartime memorabilia in a box he never opened when anyone else was around, and he would hold that dented canteen and remember that day in November 1944, when everything had balanced on the edge of disaster, and he'd found a way to tip it back toward survival. His grandson, Thomas Jr., found the canteen in that box in 1989 when he was helping his grandfather move to a smaller house after Dorothy died. Found it wrapped in an old uniform shirt, and asked what it was, why his grandfather kept a beat-up old canteen when surely there were more important mementos to save, and Hale, who was 71 years old then, whose hands shook from age and old wounds and the accumulated weight of memories, held the canteen for a long moment before saying quietly, "It saved some friends of mine once, that's all, saved them when nothing else could." And he didn't elaborate, didn't tell the full story, because how do you explain to a teenager who's never heard a shot fired in anger how a piece of dented aluminum became the difference between life and death, became the pivot point on which an entire battle turned, became proof that survival isn't always about strength or firepower but sometimes about creativity and instinct and being able to see weapons in places where no military manual would ever think to look. War turns men into weapons, transforms ordinary people into instruments of destruction and survival, but it also turns them into problem solvers, forces them to innovate under conditions where failure means death not just for themselves but for everyone depending on them. And in the darkest forest of Europe on a November day in 1944, Sergeant Thomas Hale proved that survival depended not on having the best equipment or the most firepower but on having the intelligence to recognize